So we have 3 sessions left for today. So the next session is titled Flutter at the App, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And it will be presented by Marcin. Please give him a big round of applause to welcome him.
Hi everyone. I'm going to talk about Add to App today. So adding Flutter to existing native iOS and Android applications. First, few words about me. My name is Marcin. I'm a senior Flutter developer at LeanCode. We are a software studio based in Warsaw, Poland. You also might have heard about Patrol. It's a UI testing framework that we develop and maintain. I have been a Flutter tech lead at one of the major Polish banks for 2 years, and during that time we developed a proof of concept project with Add to App. So that's where I get the experience from in that subject. I've been doing Flutter for over 4 years now. You can find me on X. So as developers, we like starting projects from scratch. We like building new apps, gaining experience from previous apps, and want to do everything right. But in reality, many enterprises have huge apps that are maintained by big teams, and those are often native applications. And they might be interested in Flutter. They see value in having one team develop for both platforms. They see the cost effectiveness of that. But it is a problem to start that. And this is where Flutter Add to App comes from. So this is basically a way to add some Flutter modules, some Flutter views to your existing applications while still keeping them. And this not only refers to rendering Flutter UI, although of course it is the main point of that, but you could also, for example, reuse Dart code reuse some Dart logic between native applications. That's also possible. So why do we want to do Add to App? What are the possible scenarios? So first, the most obvious one is we cannot afford a full rewrite of the app. That would take too much time and cost too much money. So we might approach it with a strategy when we use Add to App to add some Flutter module into native applications. Then we can start rewriting more modules from existing applications to Flutter, and maybe eventually in the future we'll be able to switch completely to make it a Flutter app, possibly with some native stuff in there. The other scenario is what we had, is that we used Add to App as a way to test the technology. A bank being a huge enterprise, they need a lot of convincing to use a new technology. So that's actually quite interesting scenario, because what you can do is you can rewrite some screen in Flutter. You can give the stakeholder 2 phones, one with the native app, the other with the app with Flutter, and see if they can actually tell the difference. And this is a very convincing argument. This is actually what we did at some point. You could also move it further. You can run tests in production. You can do A/B testing. You can do some user testing. So there are a lot of possibilities there where you can actually compare how Flutter compares to the native screen. The other scenario may be a bit more contrived one, but still can be a case in some scenarios when you have multiple apps, is you have some module that is more reusable than one application. Maybe you have some Flutter app already. Maybe you want to move some functionality to existing native applications. So this is also very flexible. So now we know that we want to do add to app. So how do we actually go about it? So there is some documentation. It's not very extensive. It has improved since we used it. Generally, for a simple app, it will work. You have everything to need to run a counter app, for example, in some native application. But what you need to remember is that add to app is not the default way of building Flutter apps, and it shows. So if you encounter some issues, you're much less likely to find a quick solution on Stack Overflow and stuff like that. And the bottom line is that if your app is huge, it won't be that simple. The docs will not be enough to actually add this Flutter module to your application. And on the other hand, if your app is small, it probably makes more sense to actually rewrite it in Flutter from scratch. So let's move on to our case that we did. As I said, it was a banking app. It was a huge banking app with, I think, they reached 2 million active monthly users at some point. So a big application. The iOS app had 500k lines of code. The Android was even bigger with 800k lines of code. Of course, a lot of custom stuff in there. And our goal was to rewrite one complex business process to Flutter. It was related to payments. It involved a couple of screens and also some more advanced stuff that I'm gonna touch later on. But our main goal was to prove that Flutter is capable for a new project. And yeah, some spoiler, it was capable. We built a new app with Flutter, banking app for corporate customers. It has been released to production. It's working really well. So how does this Flutter module actually work? So there are some things to think about. So the first and one of the most important ones is navigation, because navigation is where you move from the native world to the Flutter world and vice versa. So imagine a simple scenario. So we have a couple of native screens. From one of those native screens, we can go to a Flutter screen, and from that Flutter screen we can move to some other Flutter screens. So this is kind of simple scenario because we have a Flutter module that is self-contained. So once you go into Flutter, you can only go back to the native part. But there are some more complex scenarios. So imagine you have some native screen, then you have some Flutter screen, and from that Flutter screen you can either go to another Flutter screen or a native screen, and from that native screen, like at the bottom, you can move to another Flutter screen. So basically your navigation paths are mixing native and Flutter views. So of course this brings additional challenges. So first of all, you need some native bridges to start new Flutter views over native views. But most importantly, you need to deal with Flutter engines. And with add to app, Flutter engine is something that you don't really see a lot. If you develop iOS Android application in Flutter, you don't really need to deal with it. As we've seen, it's different when you try to develop for tvOS. But to run a Flutter view inside a native application, you need to start a Flutter engine. And it's the engine that starts the Dart entry point that renders your app. Flutter engine also actually keeps running. So if you start Flutter engine on a new Flutter screen and you go back to a native screen, it is still running. So all of this life cycle you have to handle yourself. Also, initialization of Flutter engine actually takes some time, and it is a significant amount of time. So you should be pre-warming Flutter engines. So, but what impact does it have on navigation? So if we have two Flutter navigation paths, like here, path A and path B, they will need separate Flutter engines. So when you go to a path B, you cannot reuse the engine from path A. At least there is really no easy way. Alibaba, I know they're trying to do something like this. But generally, because you need the state from path A, the navigation stack, it could be multiple Flutter pages there, you need to start a new Flutter engine. And generally with Flutter engines, there are some principles that you need to follow. As I've said before, you need to pre-warm the engine, because if you wouldn't pre-warm the engine, you would see a blank screen for a moment, and it would be very bad user experience. If you have multiple Flutter engines, you can use an optimization, Flutter engine group, which reuses resources between multiple Flutter engines. This is something that has been added, I think 2 years ago or something. An interesting case that we had is that our native iOS app used this navigation bar with this iOS animation, and we tried to use the native top bar for the Flutter screens, but then if we had multiple Flutter screens on top of each other, so this wouldn't work with a single top bar. So generally this is quite a hard problem to solve. I'm sure there is a solution for that, but our solution was just to rewrite a couple of more screens to Flutter and kind of circumvent this issue, because when we went from the dashboard to the Flutter module, then we wouldn't have to deal with this issue because we would use the single top bar. So that's also quite interesting takeaway from all of that, is that sometimes it's just easier to rewrite something than to try to connect it to the native world. What about UI? So we know developing UI in Flutter is very nice, and with Add to App it's basically the same. So once you are in a widget tree, everything works well. The thing is that with native apps you have some set of components, some design system for iOS and Android, and now you have a third set of components and you need to keep them in sync. So this actually increases maintainability cost in that case. What about assets? Assets are, you also probably will need to reuse some assets in Flutter that are already bundled in the native app, and you wouldn't want to bundle them twice. So with iOS that's possible. There is a package called iOS Platform Images, which enables you to do exactly that. For Android, sadly, there's no such thing. There's an open issue. Maybe it will be done in the future, but as of now, there is no easy way to do it. Also, some other point is that this is something that we didn't do at our project, but it is possible to, if you have a complex native component, you can actually render it inside the Flutter view, and you can also do the opposite. So you can also run Flutter subviews inside of a native view, but again, every such Flutter subview would need a separate engine because it's a different execution environment. So that's a lot of, there could be performance issues for sure. Networking, so your Add to App module will most likely have to connect to some APIs. How can we solve it? How can we integrate with the native? I mean, the thing is that we need to use some authentication tokens do some refreshing of those tokens. Often you need to attach some headers. So you might think that we could reuse the native API client instead of using Dart HTTP module. The advantage is that you don't need to rewrite the endpoints and all the models, although most probably they could be generated if we use OpenAPI spec or something like that. The biggest advantage is that we don't need to deal with the whole authentication part, because we just proxy it to the native app. Of course, it comes with some performance overhead for sure, probably not significant, but still. And we need to basically proxy everything with method channels or FFI now. The other solution is that we might use the Flutter Dart HTTP client, but still then we need to somehow synchronize the authentication state with the native API client. So now we don't have this extra overhead for the communication. We give full control to Flutter devs to how they want to handle networking. We need to rewrite those. We need to have two sets of endpoints and models. It can be generated, but still is duplicated. But the biggest disadvantage is that synchronizing the state can actually be very tricky, because if with refreshing tokens you would need some queue, some waiting. So this is some complex logic to write. So those are two possible approaches. A couple of notes on developer experience in Add2App. So first, the development setup might not be straightforward in a corporate setting. This is not strictly related to Flutter, but in our case, until we were able to actually run a Flutter app on a bank computer, it took like a month to handle accesses to proxies, VPNs. Everything was very restricted there, being it a financial institution. But this is something that, we had a deadline of 3 months to develop that, and we weren't expecting such a long time on handling, basically running the app on a bank computer. So working on the UI is great, as I said. You can also, something that's quite interesting, you can run this Flutter module as a standalone Flutter app. So you can run the Flutter module as a Flutter app without the native part. This can be useful during development, although of course this only fully works if you don't integrate with the native part, which is most probably not the case. But for developing some UI, it can actually be quite useful. We had to debug native apps a lot, so a couple of times we had to have a native debugger attached, 2 Flutter debugger attached for different engines, and debugging experience in general was not perfect. With one engine it's fine, but when you have multiple engines it gets much worse. They wouldn't always attach, so that was not perfect. CI, another thing, because we're adding new technology to existing CI. There are generally 2 approaches. So one is to use Flutter as an artifact. So we can build a Flutter module for AAR for Android and then link this Maven repository and add dependency. For iOS, we have Flutter built iOS framework, which builds a bunch of XC frameworks for Flutter, for app, and for every Flutter plugin that you might use. And we can add those as embedded frameworks in Xcode. Of course, the biggest advantage of that is that we don't impact the native app. We don't impact the CI because we just provide some artifacts. Native developers that are working on iOS and Android don't need to install Flutter and configure everything on their machines. But of course, you need to build those binaries somewhere. at first we built them just manually and uploaded them to the repository. The more streamlined approach is using Flutter as code, so you can have this Flutter module. You can use Cocoapods and Gradle to integrate this. Of course, another issue might be that Cocoapods is not used by all iOS apps. Actually, it's not being used that much anymore. Again, if we include this as Git submodule, for example, this also is also a bit hard to maintain. So generally, but this is of course the more streamlined approach to that. Okay, some native code, because that's quite important. You will need native knowledge to use add to app. So if you have Flutter developers that are not experienced in iOS and Android, it will be a very hard time to make Flutter add to app work. Because Flutter native communication is unavoidable, because you're still building one app. The fact that part of it is Flutter, part of it is iOS, part of it is Android, just makes it more complicated. So for communication, we used method channels with Pigeon Generator. I don't know if you know it. When we used it, it was not that popular yet. Now we also have FFI, which I guess also could be used, probably more performant. You can use all packages from pub for your Flutter app module. There are some caveats. If you use a Flutter package with a plugin, and that plugin, that native plugin, has a dependency on some native library, and your native app also uses that library, they need to have the same version. So if there is a version mismatch, you need to either modify the Flutter plugin, fork it, or submit a pull request or something, or modify the version in your native code. The former probably being easier in most cases. And now the case that we had, I won't be going into much detail here because we don't have that much time, but this is like a high level look at what we implemented. So we had a native app. From one of the native screens, we could open our Flutter module, which had a bunch of screens, but generally from there we would start a background process. On Android it was a foreground service. On iOS this just used background tasks, so that was a bit easier. But generally we ran a Flutter background isolate, and that isolate would check some payment status periodically, and it would display a dialog Flutter module, some dialog that was rendered in Flutter. And because this was in background, the user could go from Flutter screen back to some native screens, and we would still need to show the dialog using Flutter. So this, of course, needed to be a separate engine that would be started by this background isolate. So generally, we had 3 Flutter engines, 3 isolates communicating with each other. So generally, quite a complex setup. But the main reason for that, we wanted to show that we can actually, because this background process was the core business logic of all of that module. It was a quite complicated state machine, and we were able to rewrite it to pure Dart. So actually reuse it across iOS and Android apps. A note of app size: your app size will increase, of course. In our case, it was 27 megabytes for iOS, 15 for downloaded APK from the Play Store. So quite a lot, at least for iOS, but manageable in most cases. UI testing, you can do UI testing with native app using Flutter to app. A little plug here, we developed Patrol, which supports that use case. Anyone may be using Patrol? A couple of people. So you can actually use Patrol because it supports native integrations. Some organizational challenges, which is something non-technical but quite important. You start with a huge native app, so it has a lot of technical debt. We had legacy code, we had no documentation of this, how this module actually worked. We had to just read through the native code and try to re-implement it in Dart. Also, the screens that we developed, they were not in Figma or Sketch or anything like that. Actually, there were no actual designs because they were originally in Photoshop, but they changed dozens of times. So we just looked at the screen and tried to implement it, but measuring pixels and stuff, so to make it pixel perfect. Because native code is your ultimate source of truth if you're dealing with such use case. And you need expertise in both Flutter and native, as I've said. So at least to start the add to app, you will need some experience in your developers. Another thing is that, again, native devs often see the Flutter coming into their apps as a danger to them. So this is something that's also need to take care of. So we had some conflicts with them. They have their framework, also with SwiftUI, Jetpack Compose. Some arguments of Flutter being declarative and everything are not as valid as they used to be. So this is something also that needs some handling on the managerial level, mainly. So the key takeaways from all of that. So every project is different, of course. Need to do some research, how this add to app, how you should approach add to app in your application. You should actually, my advice would be try to isolate the Flutter module as much as possible and let Flutter shine with the UI, which is what it does best. Dealing with complex navigation paths, mixing Flutter and native will give you much more trouble. If you keep it, the Flutter module as standalone, it will be much easier. Add to app brings some issues that will not appear in a standalone Flutter app. And also think about other factors that you might miss at the beginning of the project, which is like organizational structure, technical debt. Do some audit of this native app that you're going to take on with Flutter. See if they have any docs, because this will just increase the time of the development. Okay, to finish off, we as Lean Code, we've been working on a report. We are gathering feedback from CTOs, engineering managers, tech leads using Flutter. We already have a lot of responses. We'll be releasing that in July on FlutterCon Berlin. The results, if you want to take part, we'll be very happy to hear your feedback on Flutter. We'll be also with talks with Google, so I hope it will actually have some impact on how Flutter will look like. And thank you a lot. Arigatou gozaimasu.
Thank you, Marcin, for your presentation. So we have now time for questions. So if you have any questions, staff member will take your microphone.
Thank you. So which do you think is more efficient, building an app from scratch with Flutter or adding Flutter to an existing native app?
I mean, depends what you want to achieve. From the developer's perspective, it's easier to write from scratch. But of course, if your app is huge, it will take a lot of time. So, and you still need to maintain the native app. So it's like a compromise between cost and, I mean, from the quality of from the developer's perspective, the developer experience is much better when you develop app from scratch.
Thank you.
Okay, Sasha first.
Thank you for the talk. I have a question. Are you going to implement support of collecting performance metrics like in integration testing? I understand the purpose of Patrol is not for this. You created for testing it from native perspective. But in this case, if you would like to take performance metric, you need to implement your test twice, one with Patrol and once without Patrol to collect metrics. And if you add it, it will be much more useful.
Yeah, I don't know if there are plans at the moment, to be honest, with Patrol, because I'm not a Patrol developer. So yeah, you will need to ask Mateusz about that. Probably it's on the roadmap, but I'm not sure when it will come. Yeah, and you can submit a pull request, of course.
I can create PR. I have already. But it will be. I will propose, because I'm not a Patrol developer. Maybe I did something wrong here. So we can discuss. Thank you. I thought maybe you know, and I don't need.
No, sorry, I don't know the exact Patrol roadmap. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the talk. I had a question about when you start the isolate to run some foreground service or the background task, and when you go back to the native, at that time is that service is stop, or we need to how you manage that?
So the background isolate keeps running when you move the so once we had this native screen, you go to a Flutter screen, you try the isolate. If you go back to the native screen, we would destroy the engine for the UI, but the background isolate keeps running. And basically, and this isolate would call native code, which would start a new Flutter engine, which would render a new UI. So,
because I think for native and Flutter communication, you require a channel, right?
Yeah, it requires.
So if you require some communication from that isolate to the native one, then it will be separate.
From the isolate, you just call native code. With method channel. Yeah, exactly.
So it will be similar like adding two Flutter libraries or modules into the native app.
Yes, I guess.
So separate communications for isolate and separate communication for the UI model. Is that correct understanding?
Yeah, exactly. So you need to initialize method channels inside the background isolate and inside the Flutter main module. Let's call it the UI module.
Okay, thank you.
And those could be different. Those could be the same. Depends on your case.
Yeah, thank you. I got that.
Yes, thank you for the talk. You mentioned that you are using 3 Flutter engines, that you had to do 3 Flutter engines. At which point is it even better maybe to maintain one engine, even if it's in the background, than creating 3 different engines?
I mean, this case cannot be simply done with one engine. So, because as I've said, if you go back to the native UI and you want the background task to keep running, you need to have it separate from the UI. I guess, I mean, there is Alibaba does something called Flutter Boost, which actually tries to use a single engine for multiple views and actually make this path use one Flutter engine. Yeah, but the problem, at least for the European and American market, is that the documentation is only in Chinese. So, so that's why I haven't investigated it further.
Yeah, no, but it's interesting if the app is still there, maybe.
Yeah, it is technically possible, I guess,
Yeah.
but you need to do a lot of switching between, because the engine basically caches, it has the state of the navigation, of any state management that you use, it's all there, even if you go to another screen. So to keep the navigation stack flow between multiple paths, it's technically possible, but it's a lot of work.
Thank you.
Anything else? All done? Okay, so thank you very much for insightful session and Q&A. Let's give a round of applause to him. Thank you. So we will now take a longer break for about 30 minutes. So the next session is going to start 5:25. So please feel free to go to the Ask the Speaker corner or sponsor booth. Thank you.